This is lecture 17A. Today I'm going to talk about the High Middle Ages and the sort of end game of the Middle Ages in Europe. So I talked last time about how after about 1000, Europe really began to see a takeoff and began to grow in a whole bunch of different ways. And so this period from about 1000 to 1300 is called the High Middle Ages. It's when everything is going really well in medieval European society. The population growth was amazing during the High Middle Ages. The population of Europe probably tripled. And in the process, Europeans brought acre after acre of farmland under cultivation. They cut down forests. They pretty much destroyed every bit of wilderness, not every bit, but most of the wilderness in Europe to turn it into farmland to try to handle this population growth. You saw a massive increase in trade. You saw inter-European trade as places like Scotland and Italy and and France and Germany started trading with each other on a regular basis. But also you began to see Europeans reach out more to Mediterranean trade as the Italian trading states like Venice and Genoa became major economic players by trading with the Middle East and then up into the Black Sea and then through that all the way to China. And so Europe became much more integrated once again into this global trading network that stretched all the way to China and India. It had sort of fallen out of that trading network in the early Middle Ages because the European economy was so bad, the Western European economy. So you see the growth of trade, you see the growth of cities. Cities get bigger and bigger and bigger and start to proliferate. And of course all this brings enormous wealth and power. And one of the things that's interesting about Europe at this time is, I mean, you begin to see dramatic disparities in wealth, that the aristocratic classes and the church, the elites in the church begin to get wealthier and wealthier because they control the land that's producing so much more agricultural product. And as I mentioned last time, there are also a number of innovations in agriculture like the heavy-wheeled plow and the horse collar and the introduction of beans and et cetera that allowed Europeans to dramatically increase the number of amount of food per acre they were getting. And that meant more wealth. And so Europe has these enormous disparities of wealth. Some super rich aristocrats and high church officials, and you even start to see the creation of wealth amongst the merchant classes in, say, Italian city-states, that you start to see an enormous wealth show up there. And at the same time, you still have the majority of the population as peasants who are basically subsistence farmers, etc. And with this wealth comes power, because Europeans now can afford to fight even overseas. They can afford to fund castles and knights, etc., and to maintain standing armies. And this kind of wealth and power really, in a sense, causes a crisis of confidence. Because you remember that in the last lecture I talked about how Europeans had sort of adopted the city of God ideal. When in the early Middle Ages, when everything sucked and things were falling apart, they decided to focus on the city of God, getting into heaven, living in God's spiritual land instead of the material world. And they tried to build a society that was all about spirituality, finding God, living morally, and getting everybody into heaven. And this really downplayed and even denigrated the idea of wealth, that wealth was evil. Well, now Europe is getting richer and richer, and this is a real problem. And Western Europe had thought before also that they were sort of underdogs, that the big bad Muslims were out there and the Byzantines were out there who were heretics because they were Eastern Orthodox instead of Catholic. And so Western Europe sort of thought of itself as this sort of underdog fighting against these big, bad, evil outsiders protected only by God. Well, now they're really powerful, right? And so this causes Europeans to redefine how are they going to think about themselves? How are they going to define themselves? What does it mean to be Western European? What does it mean to be Catholic, etc.? And one of the interesting things about this is that one of the ways they would do this is to redefine themselves. Instead of being poor paupers who are protected by God, they're going to redefine themselves as powerful warriors for God. And so this leads to the idea of the Crusades, that they're going to project God's power outwards. They're going to take Christianity to the rest of the world through conquest, and they're going to sort of use their newfound power on God's behalf. And this is the way that they could sort of keep that power and that wealth, and even increase the power and wealth, because they're conquering other territories and becoming rich in the process, but they can justify it in terms of Christianity. We're bringing God's message to the infidels and the heretics, and we're destroying Islam or what have you. And so this crisis of confidence, or this crisis of identity in medieval Europe, sort of leads to this new orientation of thinking of Christianity not necessarily in terms of poverty and humility and suffering through a bad material life, but rather now in terms of power and bringing God's will everywhere else, and so really projecting God's power out into the world, which is a very different idea of Christianity. So this ultimately results in the Crusades. Now, there's a lot of areas of Crusades, and this idea of a crusade, of fighting against the infidels, was an idea that showed up in all sorts of European areas. And so, I mean, when we hear the Crusades, we think of the Holy Land, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But I want to mention that there were several other areas of Crusades. One of the first areas was actually in Spain. Muslims had conquered Spain in the 700s, and they had maintained control of Spain throughout the 800s, 900s. Well, in the early 1000s, a monastic order, the Augustinian monks, began to preach that that Christians needed to retake Spain from the Muslims. They needed to liberate Spain from the heretics. And they began to actually call on young aristocrats or knights from all over Europe to go to Spain and fight on behalf of Christianity. And this turned into a crusade. And so throughout from the early 1000s to up until 1492, basically, when the last Muslim kingdom was destroyed in Spain, there was a long process. The Spanish call it the Reconquista, the reconquest of Spain, which was seen as a Christian crusade against the infidel Muslims. Right? And it gradually reconquered much of Spain, starting in the north and just moving south until the last Muslim kingdom fell in 1492 to Ferdinand and Isabella. So Spain was an important site of crusades, but Sicily and southern Italy were also, that I mentioned in the previous lecture that Muslim pirates had taken over Sicily and really dominated the Mediterranean through the 700s and 800s and 900s, but beginning in the 1000s, Christian crusaders essentially went to Sicily and southern Italy and conquered it in the name of kicking out the infidels. And so once again, you have this conquest of territory from the Muslims that's justified in terms of God, justified in terms of Christianity. And then a couple other areas. One is in Poland. A little later, after the other Crusades, a religious order called the Teutonic Knights would be founded, and they would actually use the idea of a crusade to justify conquering into Poland, to bring Catholicism to Poland, and hence Poland is Catholic today. And then there were even crusades proclaimed against heretics. That in the 1200s in southern France, there were some widespread heretical movements, and the Pope called for a crusade there to go and crush those heretical movements. So there were actually crusades against infidels and heretics within Europe, within territory dominated by Christians already. But of course, the biggest crusade is a crusade to the Holy Land. And I've already mentioned this a little bit in terms of the Mongols, etc., and the Turks, but the First Crusade was one of the results is one of the results of the expansion of the Seljuk Turks. Remember, the Seljuk Turks took over the Abbasid Caliphate, and then lots of Turkish raiders began to move on into Anatolia and attack the Byzantine Empire, and this led to the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, which the Turks won decisively, which crippled the Byzantine Empire. And the Byzantine Empire then asked Western Europe for help, and they basically framed it as, the infidel Muslim Turks are going to crush our kingdom. We're Christians, you're Christians, help us out here. In 1071, that message was not listened to. Western Europe wasn't ready for it. But in 1095, the Byzantine Emperor Alexius Comnenus sent a message to the Pope, Urban II, and said, help us out here. And Urban II, he had a whole bunch of issues going on for himself. There's another guy claiming to be Pope, etc. So Urban saw an opportunity to sort of reestablish his control of the church, but also to increase the power and cultural importance of the church by calling for a crusade to go help the Byzantines. But he knew that just saying, let's go save Byzantium from the Turks wasn't going to get a lot of people excited. So Urban actually said, let's go reconquer the Holy Land. Let's go take Jerusalem back from the Muslims. Muslims have held Jerusalem since the 600s. Let's go take it back. Right? So he calls on, he has a huge church convocation, Clermont-Ferrand in 1096, and he tells the bishops there, everyone has to go back to your territory and convince the aristocrats there that they have to go fight against the Muslims. And we're going to meet up in Vienna 1096 and go invade the Holy Land. And so this first crusade that starts in 1096 is massive. Tens of thousands of European knights, lots of them, I mean, everybody jumps on this. There are some really important big aristocrats, people who are closely related to the King of France and the kings of Germany, or the Holy Roman Emperor, but also lots of minor knights who just don't have anything to do. They're poor, they're down on their luck, and they're like, hey, here's an adventure I'll go on and maybe I can win fame and fortune. All right? And so the spread is huge, but this is an army of maybe 20,000, maybe 25,000 heavily armored knights, plus a whole bunch of hangers-on who are just following along for the adventure, thinking this is God's will and God will protect us and let's go see what happens, and we can go to Jerusalem anyway. So the First Crusade starts from Vienna and it marches slowly to Constantinople, and there the Byzantines are terrified because this is a huge army, and this is way bigger than what the Byzantines could muster, and this is the real cream of, in many cases, I mean the leaders of this are the cream of European aristocracy, and this is way more than the Byzantines wanted. So they basically say, hey, you want to conquer the Holy Land, that's great, you go that way, the Turks are over there. And so they pass through Byzantium, and they march down the southern coast of Anatolia, heading south first and then cutting over east, and into territory this loosely called the Sultanate of Rum. It's a Turkish-controlled minor kingdom. And there they run into some Turks. They win the Battle of Dorylaeum decisively. And what they discover is that they actually have a significant military advantage here, because the Turks tend to fight lightly armed on horseback. They're on small, horses, Arabian quarter horses or something similar, and they're fast and they can maneuver really well, but they're not able to carry a huge heavy weight, and so the guys don't wear much armor. They tend to be wear very little armor, but they have swords and bows and arrows. But the Crusaders are heavily armed. They have chainmail, which and with leather and straw padding behind it, which makes them more or less impervious to Turkish arrows. They have full helmets that cover their whole face. They sometimes even have chainmail over their horses, and the full metal gauntlets and etc. These guys are heavily armored, and what they discover is that, and they're on huge horses. The horses, to carry that much, rider and armor, you need big horses. And the Europeans had actually started to breed these huge horses called chargers or destriers, which were, they're enormous horses. Think of Budweiser, Clydesdale kind of horses. And if you get a whole bunch of those guys on these huge horses in a full charge at a full gallop with all this armor on, they're almost unstoppable. Right, so they run into the Turks at Dorylaeum and they almost lose, but they wind up crushing the Turks. And then they descend on Antioch, which is a major city right at the base of, where Anatolia comes in and meets the sort of north-south coast of Syria and Lebanon. And they besiege Antioch, which is a major city, for about a year, and they finally take Antioch. And then they march south to Jerusalem, and it takes them. It's actually in the summer of 1099 that they show up in front of Jerusalem, and they besiege Jerusalem, and it takes several months. But they finally build these enormous siege engines, which are essentially these huge rolling staircases or ladder contraptions that you can roll up to the walls of Jerusalem to climb over the walls. And they managed to break into the walls of Jerusalem. And as I mentioned in the previous lecture, they then proceed to slaughter everybody they find in Jerusalem, about 30,000 people. They then take over Jerusalem. And what they do then is they establish 4 what are called Crusader states. There's the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa, and Tripoli. And basically these 4 principalities stretch up from modern-day Israel, Lebanon, and into Syria and even Turkey. And they establish these new Christian kingdoms, but they have a fairly small military force that's holding on to a fairly large kingdom, and they never succeed in getting large numbers of Europeans to move to the Middle East because it's a malarial area. Western Europeans tend to die pretty quickly from disease. And so they never get a massive movement of especially women to the Holy Land to bring a European population there. So it remains a minority of European warriors ruling over a largely Muslim Arab population. And because of that, it sort of establishes a pattern that basically the Crusaders have conquered this big territory, but most of the Crusaders then turn around and go back home. They figure they've done what the Pope told them to do. They conquered the Holy Land, they're done. So they go home. And so there's a small remainder force of around the King of Jerusalem, etc. They are not strong. Well, they periodically face attacks from Muslim armies outside, and they have this big military advantage. I mean, they're pretty comfortable attacking the Turks or other Muslim armies, even if they're outnumbered 10-1, because they know their heavy armor, their huge horses are a big advantage. But they really run into significant problems, and so what tends to happen is you get this cycle where the Muslims would score a victory and threaten one of these Crusader states, or maybe even conquer one of the Crusader states, and then the Pope would call for another crusade, and they would launch a crusade, and they would send a European army there to fight against the Muslims for a while, but then most of the Crusaders would go home, and then a while later the Muslims would conquer some other chunk of territory, win another battle, and then they would call for another crusade and send it off, etc. And so the 4 Crusader states that were founded didn't last very long. Less than 100 years. They've pretty much been destroyed, although Europeans continued to send crusades to the Holy Land, and they continue to hold on to particular towns and citadels. So they had a toehold in the Middle East that they could use to launch bigger attacks, but essentially they're continually just coming from the outside and attacking the Muslims, and they fight for a while and then they go home. And this pattern would just keep repeating until by 1300 the Europeans are pretty much kicked out of the Middle East entirely, and they have lost all of the territory they ever conquered. So essentially the Europeans are sort of there for 200 years, from 1096 to about 1300, but they can't hold on to what they conquer because they never have enough population there to really create a stable kingdom. They're just sort of holding on for dear life. So that's the Crusades. Now I'm going to the Crusades actually had a number of effects and impacts, and I'm going to turn to those in the next part of the lecture on the High Middle Ages.